America at the dawn of 1980, a nation between uncertainty and routine. As the calendar turned to January 1980, the United States did not feel as though it was stepping confidently into a bold new decade. Instead, the nation seemed to drift into the year quietly, burdened by unresolved problems and accustomed to living with uncertainty. For many Americans, the arrival of 1980 brought no dramatic emotional shift. There were no parades welcoming the decade, no widespread optimism in the streets, and no clear sense that change was imminent. Life continued much as it had in the late 1970s, measured, cautious, and often frustrating. The late 1970s had left a deep impression on the American public. Years of economic instability, political disappointment, and global tension had slowly reshaped expectations. By 1980, Americans had learned not to expect quick solutions or dramatic improvements. Instead, they adjusted their daily routines to accommodate inflation, rising costs, and a general feeling that the country was no longer moving as smoothly as it once had. This adjustment did not happen suddenly. It developed gradually, almost unnoticed, until it became the background condition of everyday life. Economic anxiety was perhaps the most persistent undercurrent shaping the national mood. Inflation had become an everyday word, no longer reserved for economists or policy debates. Ordinary Americans encountered inflation each time they visited the grocery store, paid utility bills, or filled their cars with gasoline. Prices seemed to rise steadily, while wages struggled to keep pace. This imbalance created a quiet but constant pressure on households across the country. At supermarkets, shoppers compared prices more carefully than they had a decade earlier. Brand loyalty weakened as families chose cheaper alternatives. Coupon clipping, once seen as a minor habit, became a regular part of shopping routines for many middle-class households. Newspapers were filled with advertisements promoting discounts, sales, and inflation-fighting deals. These messages were not exciting. They were practical, necessary, and reflective of the times. Gasoline remained a symbol of broader economic frustration. Although the worst of the 1979 energy crisis had passed, memories of long lines and sudden shortages were still fresh. Many Americans continued to drive cautiously, combining errands into single trips and avoiding unnecessary travel. Fuel efficiency became a topic of everyday conversation, not out of environmental concern, but out of financial necessity. Smaller cars grew more common, changing the appearance of American roads in subtle ways. Housing costs added another layer of concern. Interest rates were high, making mortgages expensive and difficult to manage. For young families, the dream of owning a home felt increasingly distant. Renting became a long-term reality for many who had once assumed home ownership was inevitable. Those who already owned homes worried about adjustable rates and rising payments. These concerns rarely made headlines, but they were discussed frequently at kitchen tables and workplace break rooms. Despite these pressures, daily life continued with a sense of routine that felt almost stubborn. Americans still woke early, commuted to work, packed lunches, and returned home in the evening. Children went to school, homework was done, dinners were cooked, and television programs aired at predictable times. Routine offered comfort, even as uncertainty lingered in the background. Workplace life in 1980 was marked by caution rather than ambition. Many companies avoided expansion, focusing instead on maintaining stability. Layoffs were a constant fear, even for those who had not yet experienced them directly. Employees valued job security more than advancement, and loyalty to employers became a practical decision rather than an emotional one. Office environments felt restrained, with fewer risks taken and fewer promises made. Factories and industrial centers across the country reflected the same cautious atmosphere. Manufacturing jobs, once seen as reliable and permanent, felt increasingly fragile. Workers understood that economic forces beyond their control could reshape their lives with little warning. This awareness did not lead to panic, but it did encourage restraint. Spending was careful, savings were guarded, and long-term plans were often postponed. The mood of ordinary Americans entering 1980 was not of despair, but neither was it hopeful. It was a mood shaped by endurance. People had learned how to live with economic discomfort without allowing it to dominate every aspect of their lives. Complaints were common, but dramatic reactions were rare. Inflation fatigue set in, dulling emotional responses to bad news. Rising prices no longer shocked people, they were expected. News consumption reflected this emotional distance. Evening news broadcasts delivered updates on inflation rates, interest rates, and economic forecasts, but many viewers listened passively. The information was important, but it rarely felt actionable. Americans absorbed the news, nodded quietly, and continued with their routines. The sense that individual actions could significantly alter national trends felt limited. Political discussions, though present, often lacked intensity. Confidence in institutions had been weakened by years of disappointment. Many Americans felt disconnected from decision-makers in Washington, believing that political leaders were unable or unwilling to solve everyday problems. This belief did not always result in anger. More often, it produced resignation. Social life adjusted accordingly. Large celebrations and extravagant displays became less common in everyday settings. Family gatherings were modest, focused on practicality rather than excess. Vacations, if taken at all, were shorter and closer to home. Entertainment choices favored affordability and familiarity. Movie theaters, television, and local events provided accessible distractions from economic concerns. Television played a particularly significant role in shaping the experience of routine. In 1980, television schedules were predictable, and families often planned evenings around favorite programs. Sitcoms, news broadcasts, and sports offered a sense of continuity. These programs did not promise change or improvement, they simply filled time in a reliable way. In an era of uncertainty, reliability mattered. The passage of time itself felt slower. Without rapid technological change or constant digital stimulation, days blended together. This slowness contributed to the feeling that the country was waiting for something, though few could articulate exactly what that something might be. The future felt undefined, but not urgent. Economic anxiety also influenced relationships and personal decisions. Young adults delayed marriage or starting families, unsure of financial stability. Older Americans worried about retirement savings eroded by inflation. Conversations about money became more frequent, though often uncomfortable. Financial planning shifted from long-term optimism to short-term survival. Yet, even under these pressures, American society did not grind to a halt. Small acts of normalcy persisted. Children played outside, neighbors exchanged greetings, and community events continued as they always had. Churches held services, schools organized activities, and local governments functioned as they always had. These routines formed the backbone of everyday life, preventing uncertainty from becoming overwhelming. The dawn of 1980 did not feel historic to those living through it. There was no widespread sense that the year would later be remembered as a turning point. Instead, it felt like another chapter in a long period of adjustment. Americans were not asking for transformation, they were asking for stability. They wanted prices to stop rising, jobs to remain secure, and life to become predictable again. This desire for predictability shaped attitudes toward the future. Expectations were modest. Few imagined rapid improvement, but many hoped for gradual relief. The idea of dramatic change felt unrealistic, almost suspicious. After years of disappointment, caution felt safer than optimism. As winter progressed, the routines of daily life continued uninterrupted. Snow fell in northern states, schools closed occasionally, and heating bills rose. In warmer regions, life proceeded with little seasonal disruption. Across the country, Americans adapted quietly, adjusting budgets, routines, and expectations without fanfare. In retrospect, the opening months of 1980 represented a pause rather than a beginning. The nation stood between what it had been and what it would become, though few recognized this position at the time. Uncertainty existed, but it was familiar. Routine dominated, offering comfort without excitement. This balance between the political landscape before Reagan, end of the Carter era. As 1980 unfolded, the political atmosphere in the United States carried a sense of weariness rather than urgency. President Jimmy Carter was entering the final year of his administration, and much of the country appeared uncertain about both his leadership and the broader direction of the nation. This uncertainty did not erupt into constant protest or dramatic confrontation. Instead, it lingered quietly, shaping conversations, opinions, and expectations without dominating daily life. Jimmy Carter had come into office in 1977, promising honesty, moral leadership, and a break from the political cynicism of the past. By 1980, those promises felt distant to many Americans. The gap between expectations and results had widened over time, and public dissatisfaction had grown gradually. Carter was not universally disliked, but confidence in his ability to manage the nation's challenges had weakened. Much of this dissatisfaction was rooted in economic concerns. Inflation, high interest rates, and slow growth continued to frustrate voters. While these issues were not entirely within the president's control, many Americans viewed the White House as responsible for addressing them. Carter's speeches often emphasized patience, sacrifice, and long-term solutions, messages that did not always resonate with a population tired of waiting for improvement. Political tension during this period moved slowly, almost methodically. There was no sudden collapse of support or dramatic turning point. Instead, approval ratings declined over time, influenced by a series of events that collectively shaped public perception. Carter's leadership style, careful, detail-oriented, and cautious, was often contrasted with a growing desire for stronger, more decisive leadership. The Iran hostage crisis played a central role in defining the final year of Carter's presidency. Beginning in November 1979, when 52 American diplomats and citizens were taken hostage at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, the crisis extended into 1980 with no clear resolution. By the time the new year began, the hostages had already been held for several months, and the situation had become a constant presence in American political life. Television news programs marked the passage of time with daily updates on the number of days the hostages had been in captivity. This routine reporting reinforced a sense of stagnation. Each day looked much like the last, with no significant breakthroughs to report. The crisis became a symbol of American powerlessness, or at least the perception of it, in a rapidly changing world. For many Americans, the hostage crisis was not experienced as an emotional roller coaster, but as a slow, draining ordeal. Initial anger and shock gave way to frustration and fatigue. The lack of visible progress eroded confidence in the administration's foreign policy. Carter's cautious approach, focused on diplomacy and restraint, was seen by some as responsible and ethical, but by others as weak and ineffective. Inside Washington, political debate continued, but much of it remained procedural and restrained. Lawmakers discussed options, committees held hearings, and experts debated potential strategies. These discussions rarely captured the public's imagination. Instead, they contributed to the sense that the government was trapped in a cycle of deliberation without resolution. Public dissatisfaction was not limited to foreign policy. Domestically, Carter faced criticism from both political opponents and members of his own party. Some Democrats felt the president had failed to unify the party or articulate a compelling vision for the future. Others believed his focus on detail and process limited his ability to inspire confidence during a period of uncertainty. The 1980 election season began slowly, without immediate excitement. Potential challengers emerged, but early campaigning felt cautious and restrained. Carter's decision to seek re-election was expected, yet not enthusiastically embraced. His position as an incumbent provided advantages, but it also made him the focal point of public frustration. Within the Democratic Party, divisions became more visible as the year progressed. Senator Ted Kennedy's challenge in the Democratic primaries highlighted internal disagreements over leadership and direction. The primary contest did not generate dramatic moments early on, but it added to the perception of instability within the administration's political base. Republicans, meanwhile, observed the situation with growing confidence. Although their eventual nominee had not yet been selected, the party sensed an opportunity. Criticism of Carter's handling of the economy and foreign policy became more frequent, though often expressed in measured tones. The political environment remained tense but controlled, reflecting a broader national mood of caution. Media coverage of the Carter administration in early 1980 was consistent and persistent rather than sensational. Newspapers published detailed analyses of policy decisions, approval ratings, and diplomatic efforts. Television news maintained a steady focus on the hostage crisis, economic indicators, and campaign developments. This constant but subdued coverage contributed to a sense of ongoing pressure without dramatic escalation. For ordinary Americans, political dissatisfaction did not always translate to active engagement. Many followed developments passively, absorbing information without feeling empowered to influence outcomes. Trust in government institutions had been weakened by earlier events in the 1970s, and this skepticism remained present. Carter's leadership style continued to shape public perception. He was often described as earnest, sincere, and hard-working, but also as lacking charisma. His emphasis on moral responsibility and careful decision-making appealed to some, but failed to energize others. In a time when Americans increasingly desired reassurance and confidence, his approach felt insufficient to many. The slow-moving political tension of 1980 was reflected in the pace of policymaking. Major initiatives faced resistance, delays, or limited impact. Compromise was difficult to achieve, and bold reforms seemed unlikely. The administration focused on managing existing problems rather than introducing ambitious new programs. Foreign policy beyond Iran also contributed to the sense of strain. Relations with the Soviet Union were tense, particularly following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in late 1979. Carter responded with sanctions and a boycott of the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow. These actions were intended to demonstrate resolve, but their effectiveness was debated. To many Americans, these international developments felt distant yet troubling. They reinforced the idea that the United States was facing challenges on multiple fronts without clear solutions. The perception of declining influence abroad added to domestic dissatisfaction, even if few citizens fully understood the complexities involved. As spring approached, the political atmosphere remained unsettled. Carter continued to govern while campaigning, balancing the responsibilities of office with the demands of re-election. His speeches often emphasized experience, responsibility, and the dangers of reckless change. These messages appealed to stability but did not generate widespread enthusiasm. Political tension remained largely contained within institutions. Protests and demonstrations were limited compared to earlier decades. The public expressed dissatisfaction through opinion polls and conversations rather than mass movements. This restraint reflected both fatigue and a sense of limited alternatives. The end of the Carter era, as it appeared in early 1980, was not marked by collapse or chaos. Instead, it was characterized by gradual erosion of support and growing uncertainty about the future. Americans sensed that change was coming, but they were unsure what form it would take. Looking back, the political landscape before Reagan was defined by transition rather than resolution. Carter's presidency had been shaped by challenges that resisted easy solutions. His final year reflected the accumulation of those challenges rather than a decisive confrontation with them. At the time, few Americans viewed this period as a dramatic turning point. It felt like a continuation of the struggles of the late 1970s. The tension was real, but it moved slowly, embedded in routine political processes and daily news cycles. The end of the Carter era unfolded quietly, shaped by dissatisfaction, uncertainty, and unresolved crises. It was a period of waiting, of cautious observation, and of restrained debate. As the nation moved further into 1980, the political groundwork was being laid for a significant shift, one that would only become clear after the election had passed. But for now, however, America remained in a familiar state of political unease. The Carter administration continued its work, the hostages remained in captivity, and the public watched, listened, and waited. The transition had begun, but its outcome was still unknown, unfolding slowly within the routines of American political life.
The 1980 presidential election unfolded without the immediate sense of drama that later historians would associate with it. At the time, it appeared to many Americans as another long and procedural political process, shaped more by fatigue than excitement. The contest between incumbent President Jimmy Carter and former California Governor Ronald Reagan developed gradually, framed by routine campaign events, carefully managed debates, and a public that often seemed disengaged rather than energized. As the year began, the election was already present in the background of national life, but it did not dominate everyday conversation. Americans were accustomed to election cycles, and the process itself felt familiar. Campaign announcements, speeches, and early polling data followed patterns that had been established over decades. There was little sense that 1980 would produce an extraordinary outcome. Jimmy Carter entered the election year as a sitting president burdened by economic difficulties and foreign policy challenges. His campaign strategy emphasized experience, caution, and continuity. Carter positioned himself as a steady leader in uncertain times, arguing that complex problems required patience and careful judgment. His speeches often focused on responsibility, warning voters against what he described as simplistic solutions or risky changes. Ronald Reagan, by contrast, represented a different tone, though not an immediately disruptive one. As a former actor and two-term governor of California, Reagan brought a polished speaking style and a clear ideological message. He emphasized optimism, national strength, and a return to traditional values. However, in the early months of the campaign, Reagan was not universally viewed as a transformative figure. To many voters, he appeared as a familiar conservative voice rather than a revolutionary candidate. The primary season proceeded in a measured and methodical way. Carter faced a challenge from within his own party, most notably from Senator Ted Kennedy. This internal contest reflected dissatisfaction among some Democrats, but it did not generate widespread excitement among the general public. Primary elections, caucuses, and party conventions followed established rules and timelines, often attracting limited attention outside politically engaged circles. Reagan's path to the Republican nomination was similarly procedural. While he faced competitors, his position within the party strengthened steadily. His campaign organization focused on consistency, message discipline, and long-term planning rather than dramatic gestures. Victory in early primaries reinforced his credibility, though it did not immediately transform public sentiment. Campaign speeches during 1980 were frequent and predictable. Candidates traveled from state to state, delivering similar messages to different audiences. Carter spoke about the complexities of governance, often referencing policy details and international realities. Reagan spoke about restoring confidence and reducing the role of government,
using clear and repetitive language. For many Americans, these speeches blended together, heard briefly on evening news broadcasts or summarized in newspapers. The language of the campaigns reflected the broader mood of the country. There was little appetite for radical proposals. Voters were cautious, shaped by years of economic uncertainty and political disappointment. As a result, campaign rhetoric focused more on reassurance than inspiration. Promises were framed carefully, avoiding bold claims that might appear unrealistic. Television played a central role in shaping public perception of the election. Evening news programs covered campaign events with a consistent but restrained tone. Journalists analyzed polling data, campaign strategies, and fundraising efforts. These reports were informative but rarely dramatic. The election appeared as an ongoing process rather than a defining national moment. Public apathy became one of the defining features of the 1980 election. Many Americans followed the campaign passively, absorbing information without strong emotional reactions. Political fatigue, developed over the course of the 1970s, influenced voter behavior. Confidence in political institutions had weakened, and expectations were low. Voter turnout concerns were discussed frequently by commentators. Analysts noted a lack of enthusiasm among the electorate, particularly among younger voters. While opinions about Carter and Reagan varied, strong emotional attachment to either candidate was limited. Many voters viewed the election as a choice between two familiar political approaches rather than a decisive break from the past. Economic issues remained central to the campaign, but they were discussed in technical and abstract terms. Inflation rates, unemployment figures, and interest levels were cited repeatedly. Carter emphasized the difficulty of managing a complex global economy, while Reagan argued that government policies had worsened conditions. These debates, while important, often failed to resonate emotionally with voters. Foreign policy issues, including the ongoing Iran hostage crisis and Cold War tensions, added to the seriousness of the campaign. Carter defended his cautious approach, emphasizing diplomacy and restraint. Reagan criticized what he described as weakness, advocating for a stronger stance. However, these disagreements unfolded within a familiar Cold War framework, limiting their emotional impact. The presidential debates represented moments of increased attention, but even these events were marked by restraint. The debates were structured, formal, and carefully moderated. Candidates spoke within time limits, avoided direct confrontation when possible, and focused on prepared talking points. Viewers watched attentively, but reactions were often muted. Reagan's debate performances were noted for their calm and confidence. He avoided aggressive attacks and instead presented himself as reasonable and composed. Carter, meanwhile, emphasized experience and seriousness. The contrast between the two candidates was clear, but it did not immediately translate into dramatic shifts in public opinion. Voter behavior during the election reflected uncertainty rather than passion. Many Americans delayed forming firm opinions until late in the campaign. Undecided voters remained a significant portion of the electorate. This hesitation reflected broader doubts about political leadership and the effectiveness of government action. The long procedural nature of the election process contributed to public disengagement. Primaries, conventions, debates, and general election campaigning stretched over many months. For voters balancing work, family, and financial concerns, sustained political engagement was difficult. Elections felt like obligations rather than opportunities. Mailers, advertisements, and campaign literature filled mailboxes and television screens. These materials repeated familiar messages, emphasizing leadership, trust, and competence. While professionally produced, they rarely generated excitement. Political advertising had not yet reached the intensity or sophistication of later decades. Polling became an increasingly prominent feature of the election. Newspapers regularly published approval ratings and head-to-head comparisons. These numbers influenced perceptions, but they also reinforced the sense that the election was being managed by experts rather than driven by public enthusiasm. For some voters, polls replaced personal conviction as a guide. As the election day approached, the tone of the campaign remained controlled. There were no widespread protests, no major disruptions, and few unexpected developments. The election appeared orderly, predictable, and institutional. This stability was reassuring to some, but uninspiring to others. On Election Day itself, Americans participated quietly. Polling stations operated efficiently, staffed by local volunteers and officials. Voters cast ballots without spectacle. For many, voting was a routine civic duty rather than a moment of excitement. The process reflected decades of established democratic practice. When results began to emerge, they revealed a decisive outcome. Ronald Reagan won a clear victory, securing both the popular vote and a large electoral majority. The margin surprised some observers, particularly given the lack of visible enthusiasm during the campaign. Yet the result reflected underlying dissatisfaction rather than sudden conversion. Public reaction to the outcome was subdued. There were no mass celebrations, no widespread protests, and Americans absorbed the news through television broadcasts and newspapers, discussing it briefly before returning to daily routines. The transition of power was accepted as a normal part of democratic life. In hindsight, the 1980 election would be remembered as a significant turning point in American political history. At the time, however, it felt procedural and restrained. Campaigns, debates, and voting process unfolded without dramatic intensity. Public apathy shaped the election as much as ideological conflict. The contrast between historical importance and contemporary experience defined the election's character. Americans did not feel they were witnessing a transformation. They felt they were participating in a familiar process, choosing between two candidates.
Economic life in 1980, inflation, interest rates, and the cost of living. In 1980, economic life in the United States was defined less by dramatic collapse and more by constant pressure. Americans did not wake up each day expecting disaster, but they also did not expect relief. Inflation, high interest rates, and rising living costs had become permanent features of everyday life. These forces shaped decisions quietly, influencing how families spent money, planned for the future, and adjusted their routines without attracting widespread attention. Inflation was no longer an abstract economic term. By 1980, it was a daily experience. Prices rose steadily across nearly all sectors, and Americans felt the impact in ordinary transactions. Grocery bills increased, utility payments climbed, and services that once seemed affordable now required careful consideration. Inflation was no longer shocking anymore. It was familiar, persistent, and exhausting. Gas prices remained one of the most visible symbols of economic strain. Although the long lines of the late 1970s energy crisis had eased, fuel costs stayed high relative to earlier decades. For many families, filling a gas tank required budgeting rather than impulse. Gas stations displayed prices prominently, and drivers noticed even small increases. Conversations about fuel costs became routine, especially among commuters who relied on cars for work. Families adjusted driving habits to manage expenses. Errands were combined into single trips, unnecessary travel was reduced, and fuel efficiency became a practical concern. Smaller, more economical cars gained popularity, changing American driving culture gradually. Large, fuel-hungry vehicles began to feel impractical for everyday use. Mortgage rates were another major source of economic anxiety. Interest rates reached historically high levels in 1980, making borrowing expensive and intimidating. For those hoping to buy homes, the market felt largely inaccessible. Monthly payments were too high, and uncertainty about future rates discouraged long-term commitments. Young couples delayed purchasing homes, choosing to rent instead. Renting, once viewed as temporary, became a long-term arrangement for many middle-class Americans. Homeowners with adjustable-rate mortgages worried about rising payments. The dream of stable home ownership felt fragile, influenced more by financial conditions than personal readiness. Unemployment numbers added to the sense of insecurity. While not at catastrophic levels nationwide, unemployment remained a constant concern. Job stability could no longer be assumed, even in industries that had once offered lifetime employment. Layoffs occurred quietly, without dramatic announcements, but their impact spread through communities. Workers responded by prioritizing stability over advancement. Career risks were avoided, and loyalty to employers increased, not out of passion, but necessity. Changing jobs felt dangerous in an uncertain economy. Many Americans stayed in positions they found unsatisfying simply because they offered reliable income and benefits. Wages struggled to keep pace with inflation. Raises, when offered, often failed to match rising living costs. This created a subtle decline in purchasing power that many families felt but found difficult to articulate. The sense of working just to maintain the same standard of living became widespread. Household budgeting became more disciplined. Families tracked expenses more carefully, comparing prices and avoiding unnecessary purchases. Coupon clipping grew common across income levels. Sales and discounts attracted attention, and brand loyalty weakened. Practicality replaced preference in many buying decisions. Grocery shopping reflected these adjustments clearly. Shoppers compared unit prices, selected generic brands, and reduced luxury items. Meat consumption declined in some households due to cost, replaced by cheaper alternatives. Eating out became less frequent, reserved for special occasions rather than routine convenience. Utilities and household bills also contributed to financial pressure. Heating and electricity costs rose, particularly during winter months. Families adjusted thermostats, layered clothing indoors, and conserved energy. These changes were not dramatic, but they altered daily habits subtly and persistently. Healthcare costs, though not yet the dominant national issue they would later become, still represented a growing concern. Medical bills strained budgets, and families weighed the cost of care carefully. Insurance coverage mattered more than ever, influencing job choices and personal decisions. Education expenses also increased. Tuition and related costs placed additional strain on families with college-age children. Some students delayed higher education or worked part-time to manage expenses. Long-term planning became cautious, shaped by uncertainty rather than optimism. Inflation fatigue affected attitudes as much as behavior. Americans grew tired of hearing economic warnings without seeing improvement. News reports discussed inflation rates, interest levels, and monetary policy regularly, but these discussions rarely changed personal circumstances. Over time, people learned to tune out economic commentary while continuing to adapt privately. The Federal Reserve's efforts to control inflation, including tight monetary policy, were widely discussed but poorly understood by the general public. High interest rates were experienced directly, while their purpose remained abstract. The connection between policy and everyday hardship felt distant. Small businesses felt the strain as well. Borrowing costs limited expansion, and consumer spending slowed. Many businesses focused on survival rather than growth. Hiring slowed, and investment decisions were postponed. Economic caution became widespread across sectors. Despite these challenges, daily life continued with remarkable consistency. Children attended school, adults went to work, and communities functioned. Economic stress did not halt routine activities, it reshaped them. The absence of visible crisis contributed to the perception that conditions were manageable, even as strain accumulated. Entertainment choices reflected economic realities. Affordable options, such as television and local events, replaced costly outings. Movie theaters remained popular, offering relatively inexpensive escape. Leisure time was shaped by budget considerations rather than desire alone. Family dynamics were influenced by financial pressure. Conversations about money became more frequent and more serious. Parents worried about providing stability, while children became aware of limitations earlier than previous generations. Expectations were adjusted quietly. Saving money became difficult. Inflation eroded the value of savings, discouraging long-term accumulation. Some families spent cautiously, fearing that money saved would lose value. Others attempted to invest, though opportunities felt risky. Financial decision-making lacked confidence. Retirement planning grew uncertain. Older Americans worried that inflation would undermine fixed incomes. Pensions and savings appeared less reliable than before. These concerns contributed to anxiety about the future, particularly among those nearing retirement age. The cost of living varied by region, but economic pressure was widespread. Urban areas faced higher housing costs, while rural communities dealt with limited employment opportunities. Regional differences shaped experiences, but the underlying strain was shared nationally. By the end of 1980, economic life remained unresolved. Inflation persisted, interest rates stayed high, and costs continued to rise. There was little sense of immediate relief, but also little expectation of sudden collapse. Americans adjusted, endured, and carried on. The economic experience of 1980 was not defined by a crisis, but by endurance. Families learned to live within constraints, making small adjustments that collectively reshaped American life. These changes rarely attracted attention, but they left lasting impressions. In hindsight, the economic conditions of 1980 represented a turning point. At the time, however, they felt like an extension of existing struggles. Americans did not perceive themselves as living through history. They believed they were simply managing difficult circumstances. Economic life in 1980 was shaped by inflation, high interest rates, and rising costs, but also by resilience. Ordinary families responded not with panic, but with routine adjustments. The economy pressed constantly, but life continued steadily. This combination of pressure and persistence defined the era. The cost of living rose, uncertainty remained, and expectations stayed modest. Americans entered the new decade not with confidence, but with experience, having learned how to live within limits imposed by an economy that demanded patience rather than promise.
Cold War routine. America and the Soviet Union in a predictable standoff. By 1980, the Cold War no longer felt new to Americans. It had become a condition rather than an event, a permanent backdrop to national life that shaped policies, budgets, and assumptions without demanding daily emotional engagement. The ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union had lasted for decades, and by the beginning of the new decade, it had settled into a predictable standoff. There were moments of tension and occasional crises, but for most Americans, the Cold War was experienced as routine rather than urgent. Daily Cold War reality was defined by familiarity. Americans had grown up hearing about communism, nuclear weapons, and global competition. These concepts were taught in schools, discussed in news programs, and referenced in political speeches. Yet by 1980, they rarely provoked strong reactions. The Cold War was understood as something always present, always unresolved, and largely beyond the control of ordinary citizens. News broadcasts regularly included updates about relations with the Soviet Union. These reports followed a familiar pattern. Officials made statements,
Diplomats met behind closed doors, and analysts discussed strategic balance. Rarely did these updates change the routines of everyday life. Most Americans listened, acknowledged the information, and returned their attention to immediate concerns. Military spending was one of the most visible institutional expressions of the Cold War, though its impact on daily life was indirect. Defense budgets remained large, consuming significant portions of federal resources. Discussions about weapons systems, troop deployments, and strategic readiness were common in political circles. For the average citizen, however, these numbers felt abstract. The scale of military spending was difficult to visualize, and its consequences were not immediately tangible. Defense industries employed millions of Americans, especially in certain regions. In these communities, the Cold War was experienced more directly through stable employment and government contracts. Aerospace factories, shipyards, and research facilities operated steadily, producing weapons systems designed for conflicts that everyone hoped would never occur. Workers performed their tasks without dramatic awareness of their role in a global standoff. Outside these regions, military spending appeared mainly in news reports and political debates. Taxpayers understood that defense was expensive, but the connection between spending and personal financial strain felt indirect. The Cold War justified these expenses in a way that few openly questioned. The assumption that national security required constant preparedness was widely accepted. Nuclear anxiety remained present but subdued. Americans were aware that nuclear weapons existed in vast numbers and that their use would be catastrophic. This knowledge had been part of public consciousness since the 1950s. By 1980, however, it no longer produced widespread fear. Instead, it existed as a background concern, acknowledged intellectually, but rarely confronted emotionally. Civil defense drills and nuclear preparedness education had declined in visibility compared to earlier decades. Schools no longer emphasized duck and cover exercises with the same intensity. Public shelters existed, but few people actively planned to use them. The possibility of nuclear war was considered remote, even if theoretically devastating. This normalization of nuclear threat did not mean Americans were unaware of danger. Rather, it reflected a psychological adjustment. Living with constant fear was unsustainable, so the threat was mentally compartmentalized. Nuclear war was understood as possible, but unlikely, and therefore not worth daily anxiety. Policy decisions related to the Cold War often felt distant to citizens. Negotiations over arms control treaties, strategic doctrines, and alliance commitments took place far from public view. These decisions were explained in technical language that discouraged emotional engagement. Terms such as deterrence, mutually assured destruction, and strategic parity became part of political vocabulary, but few fully understood their implications. When policy shifts occurred, they were usually gradual. Changes in defense posture or diplomatic tone were introduced carefully, avoiding sudden disruption. This gradualism reinforced the perception of stability. Even when tensions increased, as they did following the invasion of Afghanistan in late 1979, the response felt measured rather than explosive. The invasion of Afghanistan briefly brought the Cold War back into sharper focus. News coverage highlighted the event as a significant escalation, and political leaders spoke about renewed confrontation. Yet even this moment of tension did not fundamentally alter daily life for most Americans. Gas prices, employment, and personal finances remained more immediate concerns. The U.S. response, including sanctions and the decision to boycott the 1980 Moscow Olympics, demonstrated how Cold War policy decisions were expressed symbolically rather than directly. These actions signaled disapproval without risking military confrontation. For citizens, the boycott was more noticeable as a loss of expected sports coverage than as a strategic maneuver.
Cold War rhetoric persisted in political speeches, but its emotional impact was limited. Leaders spoke about freedom, democracy, and global responsibility, using language that had been repeated for decades. These themes were familiar and predictable. They reinforced national identity without generating urgency. Media coverage contributed to this sense of routine. Newspapers published detailed analyses of Soviet actions and American responses, but these articles often appeared alongside reports on domestic issues. Television news allocated time to international developments, but rarely allowed them to dominate broadcasts unless a crisis was unfolding. For many Americans, the Cold War was managed by experts. Diplomats, military planners, and intelligence officials were entrusted with responsibility. Ordinary citizens did not feel personally involved in strategic decision-making. This distance reduced anxiety, but also limited engagement. Public opinion polls showed concern about international security, but these concerns rarely translated into action. Protests against nuclear weapons existed, but they did not define national mood in 1980. Compared to earlier periods, activism related to Cold War issues was restrained. Education reinforced this normalization. Students learned about the Cold War as an ongoing condition rather than a dramatic conflict. Textbooks described ideological differences, historical events, and strategic concepts in neutral terms. This approach framed the standoff as something to be understood rather than feared. Entertainment media reflected similar attitudes. Films and television programs occasionally depicted Cold War themes, but they were often stylized or distant from everyday reality. These portrayals did not significantly alter public perception. The Cold War remained abstract, more concept than experience. Military service during this period also reflected routine rather than crisis. The all-volunteer force operated steadily without the urgency associated with wartime mobilization. Service members trained, rotated assignments, and maintained readiness. Their presence in society was acknowledged but not emphasized. Policy debates within Washington continued with seriousness but limited drama. Lawmakers discussed defense appropriations, arms control agreements, and alliance commitments through established procedures. These discussions rarely captured sustained public attention. The predictability of the standoff contributed to its stability. Both the United States and the Soviet Union understood the risks of escalation. This mutual understanding shaped cautious behavior. While tensions existed, outright confrontation was avoided through restraint and calculation. For Americans, this predictability translated into emotional distance. The Cold War influenced national priorities, but it did not dictate daily choices. Families planned for education, careers, and retirement without factoring in international conflict. The future felt uncertain, but not imminently threatened by war. By 1980, the Cold War had become part of the national routine. It shaped budgets, policies, and rhetoric, but it did not disrupt daily life. Americans lived with the knowledge of global tension without allowing it to dominate their thoughts. This normalization had consequences. It reduced fear, but it also encouraged complacency. The absence of crisis made it easy to overlook the significance of policy decisions. Strategic choices were made quietly with limited public scrutiny. The Cold War routine reflected a balance between awareness and detachment. Americans knew the stakes were high, but they trusted institutions to manage them. This trust was not absolute, but it was sufficient to prevent widespread anxiety.
Social life and culture in 1980 America. Ordinary days, familiar habits. In 1980, social life and culture in the United States were not defined by dramatic transformation. Instead, they were shaped by continuity. For most Americans, daily life followed familiar patterns that had been established years earlier. While historians would later identify the year as part of a broader transition, Those living through it largely experienced stability rather than change. Ordinary days passed quietly, guided by routines that provided structure and predictability in an uncertain economic and political environment. The rhythm of American life in 1980 was steady. Mornings began early for working adults, many of whom followed the same commute routes they had taken for years. Breakfast was often simple and practical, shaped by time constraints rather than preference. Children prepared for school, parents left for work, and households moved into the day with little variation. These routines were rarely questioned. They were accepted as the normal structure of life. Television played a central role in shaping shared experiences. In 1980, television schedules were fixed and predictable. Programs aired at specific times, and viewers planned their evenings accordingly. There was no on-demand viewing, no streaming, and limited recording options. Missing a program meant waiting for a rerun if one was offered at all. This structure encouraged routine and reinforced habits. Evening news broadcasts were a daily ritual for many families. After dinner, televisions were turned on to receive updates about national and international events. Anchors delivered news in measured tones, and stories followed a consistent format. While major events were covered, much of the content focused on ongoing issues rather than breaking developments. Viewers listened attentively but without urgency. Entertainment programming provided relief from daily pressures. Sitcoms, dramas, and variety shows offered familiar characters and predictable narratives. These programs did not challenge viewers or demand deep engagement. They served as background comfort, filling time and creating a sense of continuity. Watching television together was a shared family activity, reinforcing household routines. Newspapers remained an important source of information. Many Americans began their mornings by reading local or national papers. Headlines were scanned, editorials read selectively, and classified sections reviewed carefully. Newspapers delivered detailed coverage of politics, economics, and local events, but reading them was often a quiet, solitary activity. The pace of news consumption was slower than in later decades. Stories unfolded over days or weeks rather than hours. This gradual flow reduced emotional intensity. Americans were informed but rarely overwhelmed. News became part of routine rather than a constant source of disruption. Office life in 1980 reflected similar patterns of stability. Offices were structured hierarchically with clear roles and expectations. Offices were largely paper-based environments. Filing cabinets, typewriters, and physical memos dominated daily operations. Communication moved slowly, requiring patience and planning. Most office workers followed strict schedules. The workday began and ended at fixed times, with limited flexibility. Lunch breaks were short and predictable. Productivity was measured by presence as much as performance. This structure reinforced routine and minimized uncertainty. Dress codes in offices were conservative. Men typically wore suits or dress shirts and ties, while women followed professional standards that emphasized formality. Clothing choices reflected expectations rather than personal expression. Office culture valued conformity and reliability. Social interactions at work were polite but restrained. Conversations focused on tasks, schedules, and practical matters. Personal topics were discussed cautiously. Workplaces were places of responsibility rather than emotional connection. These norms reinforced separation between professional and personal life. Family routines formed the core of social life for many Americans. Evenings were often spent at home, with dinner serving as a central activity.
Meals were prepared regularly, and families gathered at tables to eat and talk. These moments were structured and predictable, offering stability amid broader uncertainty. Household roles were defined by tradition and practicality. While social changes were underway, many families still followed familiar divisions of responsibility. These arrangements were not always ideal, but they were understood and accepted as normal. Children's lives were shaped by school schedules, homework, and extracurricular activities. Education followed standardized curricula, and school days were structured consistently. Parents expected schools to provide discipline and order. Change, when it occurred, was gradual. Weekends offered limited variation from weekday routines. Shopping, errands, and household maintenance filled much of the time. Leisure activities were modest and local. Families visited relatives, attended religious services, or participated in community events. These activities reinforced social connections without introducing novelty. Religion remained an important part of social life for many Americans. Church attendance provided structure, community, and moral guidance. Services followed familiar formats, and religious calendars influenced weekly routines. For some, faith offered reassurance during uncertain times. Social gatherings were generally small and informal. Large celebrations were reserved for specific occasions. Everyday social interaction occurred among neighbors, co-workers, and extended family. These relationships were maintained through habit rather than deliberate effort. Communication technology limited spontaneity. Without mobile phones or instant messaging, social plans required advanced coordination. Missed connections were common and accepted. The absence of constant communication reduced pressure and encouraged patience. Cultural change in 1980 was subtle rather than dramatic. Trends in music, fashion, and entertainment evolved gradually. New influences appeared, but they did not immediately replace existing norms. Popular culture balanced innovation with familiarity. Music consumption reflected this balance. Radio stations played a mix of established artists and newer sounds. Listening habits were shaped by broadcast schedules rather than personal choice. Music accompanied daily activities without demanding attention. Fashion trends changed slowly. Clothing styles reflected practicality and affordability. While individual expression existed, it was limited by social expectations and economic constraints. Fashion served function as much as identity. Public spaces reinforced routine. Shopping malls, offices, schools, and community centers operated according to predictable schedules. These environments were designed for efficiency rather than creativity. Movement through them followed established patterns. Community life remained stable. Local institutions such as schools, libraries, and town councils continued their work without interruption. Civic engagement existed, but it was restrained. Participation often took the form of attendance rather than activism. The pace of life in 1980 allowed for reflection but not urgency. Without constant digital stimulation, Americans experienced time differently. Days felt longer but less fragmented. This temporal stability contributed to the perception that little was changing. Media representations of American life reinforced this impression. Television programs depicted familiar settings and predictable conflicts. These portrayals reflected reality rather than challenging it. Culture mirrored routine rather than questioning it. Generational differences existed, but they did not dominate social life. Older and younger Americans shared many habits and expectations. Change occurred within continuity rather than through disruption. Economic pressures influenced social behavior, but they did not redefine it. Families adjusted spending and expectations without altering fundamental routines. Social life adapted quietly. By the end of 1980, American social life looked much like it had at the beginning of the year. The same habits persisted, the same routines continued, and the same structures remained in place. There was no sense of dramatic
Technology and industry in 1980, progress without excitement. In 1980, technology and industry in the United States existed in a state of gradual movement rather than dramatic transformation. Progress was present, but it was uneven, cautious, and often unnoticed by the majority of Americans. While later decades would celebrate rapid innovation and disruption, the experience of technology in 1980 felt restrained. Change occurred slowly, embedded within existing systems rather than replacing them. For most citizens, technology did not feel exciting or revolutionary. It felt functional, distant, and sometimes unnecessary. Early computers represented the most visible sign of technological change, yet their impact on daily life was limited. Computers existed, but they were not personal companions or household essentials. They were large, expensive, and often confined to offices, universities, and specialized industries. Most Americans had never touched a computer, and many had only a vague understanding of what one did. In corporate environments, computers were used primarily for data processing, accounting, and record-keeping. These machines occupied entire rooms, required specialized staff, and operated under strict procedures. Their purpose was efficiency, not creativity. Employees submitted information to be processed, often waiting days for results. This workflow did not inspire excitement. It reinforced hierarchy and routine. The introduction of personal computers had begun, but adoption was slow. Early models were expensive and required technical knowledge that discouraged casual use. Hobbyists and professionals showed interest, but the general public remained cautious. Computers were viewed as tools for specialists, not as devices for everyday life. Many Americans encountered computers indirectly. Bank statements, payroll processing, and billing systems increasingly relied on computerized systems. Errors, when they occurred, were blamed on the computer, a term that suggested both authority and mystery. Technology was trusted to manage information, even if its workings were poorly understood. Manufacturing, once the backbone of American industry, faced visible decline by 1980. Factories closed quietly in many regions, particularly in the Midwest and Northeast. Industrial towns experienced gradual job losses rather than sudden collapse. The decline was spread over years, making it difficult to identify a single moment of crisis. Workers who had relied on manufacturing jobs for stability found themselves uncertain about the future. Automation and global competition reduced demand for labor even as productivity increased. Machines replaced some tasks, but not in a way that generated excitement. Automation was associated with job loss rather than opportunity. Industrial production continued, but its cultural significance diminished. Manufacturing no longer symbolized national strength as it once had. Instead, it became a sector struggling to adapt. This shift affected communities deeply, though often without widespread attention. Corporate offices grew in importance as manufacturing declined. White-collar employment expanded, offering stability to those who could access it. Office environments were structured, formal, and process-driven. Technology in these spaces supported administration rather than innovation. Typewriters remained central to office work. Documents were typed, corrected manually, and filed physically. Word processing technology existed, but had not yet replaced traditional methods. Secretaries played crucial roles, managing information flow and maintaining organizational order. Communication within corporations relied on phones, memos, and meetings. Decisions moved slowly through chains of authority. Technology reinforced existing power structures rather than challenging them. Efficiency improved incrementally, but the pace felt controlled. The adaptation of new technology was cautious. Companies invested in systems only after careful evaluation. Risks were avoided, and experimentation was limited. The goal was stability, not disruption. This approach reflected broader economic uncertainty and conservative management practices. Industrial research continued, but it rarely captured public attention. Advances in engineering, material science, and computing occurred quietly within laboratories. These developments laid groundwork for future innovation, but their immediate impact was limited. The relationship between technology and labor was tense. Workers feared displacement, while employers sought efficiency. This tension discouraged enthusiasm. Technology was viewed as a threat rather than a promise. Education systems began to acknowledge technological change, but integration was slow. Computer literacy was not yet a standard expectation. Schools focused on traditional skills, preparing students for familiar careers rather than emerging fields. The pace of technological change allowed Americans to adjust gradually. There was time to learn, adapt, and resist. This slowness reduced anxiety but also delayed opportunity. Innovation did not disrupt daily life. It waited quietly in the background. Consumer technology remained limited. Household appliances improved incrementally, offering reliability rather than novelty. Televisions, radios, and kitchen appliances functioned dependably, without frequent upgrades. Consumers replaced items when necessary, not for excitement. The absence of rapid change shaped attitudes. Americans did not expect technology to redefine their lives. They saw it as supportive rather than transformative. This expectation influenced investment, education, and cultural perception. Industry leaders spoke about modernization, but their language emphasized control and planning. The future was discussed cautiously. Technological optimism existed, but it was restrained by economic realities. Government policy supported technological development, particularly in defense and research sectors. These investments were significant, but their benefits were indirect. Military technology advanced more rapidly than civilian applications, reinforcing the perception that innovation served distant purposes. The gap between technological potential and everyday experience widened. While experts discussed digital futures, most Americans lived within analog routines. This disconnect limited engagement and enthusiasm. By the end of 1980, technology and industry had not transformed American life. They had evolved quietly, preparing for changes that were not yet visible. Progress occurred without excitement, shaped by caution and continuity. Looking back, this period appears transitional. At the time, it felt stable. Americans did not feel on the edge of a technological revolution. They felt surrounded by familiar tools and routines. Technology in 1980 was present but not dominant. It served systems rather than individuals. Industry continued, but its role in national identity weakened. The slow adaptation of technology reflected broader societal attitudes. Change was approached carefully. Stability was valued. Innovation was tolerated, but not celebrated. This approach had consequences. It preserved order, but delayed transformation. Opportunities existed, but they were not widely recognized. Technology and industry in 1980 represented progress without excitement. Advances occurred quietly, shaping infrastructure rather than culture. Americans lived with technology, but rarely felt inspired by it. The era was defined by preparation rather than realization. Systems were built, skills were developed, and foundations were laid. The impact would come later. For those living in 1980, technology was not a story of disruption. It was a story of adjustment. Industry continued, offices operated, and machines worked in the background. Life moved forward steadily. Progress happened, but it did not announce itself.
This quiet evolution defined the technological experience of the time.
Foreign policy beyond headlines. Decisions made quietly. In 1980, American foreign policy was shaped less by dramatic public moments and more by quiet decisions made far from public attention. While headlines occasionally highlighted crises or speeches, much of the nation's interaction with the world occurred through routine diplomatic processes, internal policy memos, and meetings that attracted little interest from ordinary citizens. For most Americans, foreign policy felt distant, technical, and largely irrelevant to daily life. The structure of foreign policy decision-making reinforced this distance. Diplomats, advisors, and analysts worked within established institutions, following procedures refined over decades. Meetings took place in government offices, embassies, and conference rooms, where discussions were formal, measured, and carefully documented. These conversations rarely produced immediate or visible outcomes, contributing to the perception that foreign policy was slow and unchanging. Diplomatic meetings were frequent but understated. Representatives met with allies and rivals alike, discussing trade, security, and political stability. These meetings followed familiar protocols, emphasizing continuity rather than innovation. Agendas were prepared in advance, statements were carefully worded, and disagreements were managed quietly. For those involved, diplomacy was work, not drama. Policy memos played a central role in shaping decisions. Written by experts and circulated within government departments, these documents analyzed risks, outlined options, and recommended actions. Their language was technical and cautious, designed to inform rather than persuade. Most Americans never saw these memos, and few were aware of their influence. The process of drafting and reviewing memos slowed decision-making. Multiple layers of approval ensured consistency but limited flexibility. This structure reduced the likelihood of sudden change. Policies evolved gradually, shaped by accumulated analysis rather than bold vision. Middle East involvement exemplified this quiet approach. While the region occasionally appeared in headlines, much of America's engagement occurred through routine diplomacy. Meetings with regional leaders, discussions about oil supply, and assessments of political stability were ongoing. These activities rarely captured public attention unless a crisis emerged. Energy security remained a major concern, though it was discussed primarily in technical terms. Ensuring stable access to oil required negotiation, monitoring, and contingency planning. These efforts were continuous and methodical. Americans experienced their effects indirectly through fuel prices and economic conditions rather than through political awareness. Military presence in the Middle East was limited and cautious. Decisions about deployment were made carefully, balancing strategic interests with political risk. These choices were debated internally, often without public input. The absence of dramatic action reinforced the sense that foreign policy was managed quietly. Low public interest global events filled much of the foreign policy agenda. Changes in leadership in smaller nations, trade negotiations, and regional disputes were monitored consistently. Analysts produced reports, and diplomats adjusted strategies accordingly. These events rarely appeared on front pages, but they influenced long-term relationships. International organizations provided additional forums for quiet decision-making. Meetings at the United Nations and other institutions followed predictable routines. Resolutions were proposed, debated, and often revised without fanfare. Participation signaled commitment to stability rather than ambition. Public awareness of these processes was limited. News coverage focused on major events, leaving routine diplomacy largely invisible. When foreign policy appeared in the media, it was often simplified, emphasizing outcomes rather than process.
This simplification reinforced the idea that decisions were distant and abstract. For ordinary Americans, foreign policy was experienced indirectly. Its effects appeared in economic conditions, energy availability, and international reputation. The connection between policy decisions and personal life was difficult to trace, reducing engagement. Government officials accepted this lack of attention as normal. Foreign policy was understood as a specialized field requiring expertise and discretion. Public involvement was considered unnecessary, even undesirable for many decisions. This approach reflected broader attitudes about governance. Complexity was managed through institutions rather than public debate. Stability was valued over transparency. The goal was to maintain balance rather than pursue dramatic change. Cold War considerations influenced foreign policy quietly. Strategic decisions were framed within established doctrines. Avoiding escalation remained a priority. These concerns shaped interactions across regions, including the Middle East, but were rarely explained fully to the public. Diplomatic language emphasized caution. Statements avoided strong commitments or emotional appeals. This restraint reduced public interest, but maintained flexibility. Ambiguity was often intentional. The pace of foreign policy work matched the broader rhythm of government. Days were filled with meetings, reports, and correspondence. Progress was measured incrementally. Success was defined by the absence of crisis rather than visible achievement. This invisibility shaped public perception. Foreign policy appeared static, even though it required constant attention. The absence of headlines suggested inactivity, though in reality, decisions were being made continuously. Criticism of this approach existed, but it remained limited. Some observers argued that the lack of public engagement weakened accountability. Others believed discretion was essential for effectiveness. These debates rarely reached a wide audience. As 1980 progressed, foreign policy continued along established paths. Adjustments were made quietly in response to global developments. These changes accumulated gradually, influencing long-term outcomes without altering daily life. Looking back, this period reveals how much of foreign policy occurs beyond public view. The absence of excitement did not indicate absence of importance. Quiet decisions shaped international relationships and set conditions for future events. For Americans living in 1980, however, these processes remained largely invisible. Foreign policy existed as a distant concept, managed by professionals and reported selectively. It did not disrupt routines or demand attention. This distance contributed to a sense of detachment. Citizens trusted institutions to handle global affairs, focusing their own energy on domestic concerns. The world beyond borders felt remote. Foreign policy beyond headlines defined the era. Decisions were made quietly, through memos and meetings rather than speeches and crises. The lack of drama was intentional, reflecting a preference for stability. In hindsight, these quiet choices mattered. They influenced alliances, conflicts, and economic conditions. At the time, they passed unnoticed. The experience of foreign policy in 1980 was one of background management. It did not inspire or alarm. It operated steadily, shaping outcomes without spectacle. This quiet approach reflected the broader character of the period. Change occurred slowly, guided by caution. Foreign policy moved forward without demanding attention, woven into the fabric of routine governance. For most Americans, the world continued as expected. Decisions were made, policies adjusted, and diplomacy conducted, all beyond the headlines.
Media, newspapers, and public attention in 1980. In 1980, the way Americans consumed news reflected habits formed over decades. Information arrived at fixed times through familiar channels and in predictable formats. Newspapers landed on doorsteps in the morning. Radio delivered headlines during commutes. Television news appeared in the evening, framed by weather reports and sports updates. This structure shaped not only what Americans knew, but how they felt about events beyond their immediate lives. The newspaper remained central to public awareness. Major national papers, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, carried long articles printed in narrow columns. Stories unfolded gradually, often spanning multiple pages. Readers encountered foreign policy, economics, and domestic politics alongside local crime reports and classified ads. Reading the paper was routine, not urgent. Most Americans did not read every article. They skimmed headlines, paused at stories of personal interest, and ignored others entirely. Long investigative pieces were respected, but rarely discussed outside educated circles. The physical nature of newspapers encouraged selective attention. Pages were folded, sections skipped, and articles abandoned halfway through. Local newspapers played a particularly important role. They reported on school boards, city councils, and regional businesses. These stories felt more relevant than national or international news. For many readers, national politics existed at the margins of daily life, overshadowed by local concerns. Television news followed a similar pattern of predictability. The evening broadcast aired at a fixed hour, often watched while families ate dinner or relaxed after work. Anchors spoke in measured tones, presenting stories with minimal emotion. Visuals were limited, often static, and relied on brief footage or still images. The structure of television news reinforced distance. Stories were short, tightly edited, and rarely explored in depth. Viewers received summaries rather than analysis. Events were presented as completed facts rather than ongoing processes. This format reduced emotional engagement. Cable news existed, but had not yet transformed media consumption. Most households relied on a small number of major networks. Choice was limited, and viewers accepted this limitation as normal. News was something received, not selected. Radio provided updates, but rarely depth. News segments were brief, often interrupting music or talk programming. These updates reinforced awareness without demanding attention. Listeners absorbed information passively while driving or working. Magazines offered longer analysis, but their audience was smaller. Weekly publications arrived days after events occurred, reducing urgency. Readers engaged with these articles during leisure time, not as part of daily routine. This delayed engagement softened emotional response. The language of news in 1980 was formal and restrained. Journalists avoided personal opinion, emphasizing objectivity. Emotional language was rare. This style encouraged detachment rather than involvement. News was something to understand, not something to feel. Public attention followed these cues. Americans consumed news as background information. It informed, but rarely mobilized. Political events unfolded without sustained public reaction. Interest rose briefly during major moments, then faded. The Iran hostage crisis demonstrated this pattern. While it received consistent coverage, it became a routine presence in the news. Daily updates reported no change. Over time, attention dulled. The crisis became part of the media landscape rather than a focal point of concern. Lengthy articles contributed to this fatigue. Stories provided context and history, but their density discouraged repeated reading. Information accumulated without resolution, reducing emotional impact. Even major political events were framed cautiously. Campaign coverage focused on schedules, speeches, and polling numbers. Journalists reported without overt judgment. This approach maintained neutrality but limited engagement. Public discussion mirrored media tone. News conversations were brief and factual. Opinions were shared quietly,
often without strong conviction. News informed identity less than it would in later decades. Letters to the editor were one of the few public feedback mechanisms. These letters were selective, filtered, and delayed. Public response appeared slowly and modestly. Visual imagery in news was limited. Black and white photos dominated newspapers. Television footage lacked immediacy. This visual restraint reduced emotional intensity. The absence of constant updates reinforced patience. Americans expected delays between events and information. This expectation shaped emotional response. Urgency was rare. Media institutions valued credibility over speed. Accuracy was prioritized, even at the cost of immediacy. Corrections appeared quietly. Trust in media was relatively stable. This trust reduced skepticism, but also reduced scrutiny. Audiences accepted information without demanding explanation. The relationship between media and public was passive. Education influenced engagement. College-educated readers consumed more in-depth news. Others relied on headlines and summaries. Media use reflected social divisions without amplifying them. Advertising surrounded news content, further normalizing it as routine consumption. News shared space with product promotions, reinforcing its place in daily life rather than civic urgency. Children observed news indirectly. Evening broadcasts played in the background. Serious events were mentioned without explanation. This exposure normalized distance from global issues. Breaking news was rare. Interruptions signaled importance. Their infrequency made them notable. Most days passed without disruption. This rhythm shaped memory. Events blurred together. Only moments marked by interruption stood out. Others faded quickly. Journalists themselves worked within constraints. Deadlines were fixed. Space was limited. Stories competed for placement. Editorial decisions prioritized balance over emphasis. The result was a steady flow of information with limited emotional peaks. Americans remained informed but detached. News did not dominate identity or conversation. Public attention shifted slowly. Major trends were recognized only in hindsight. Media coverage reflected this gradual awareness. As 1980 progressed, this system remained stable. Technological change had not yet altered consumption patterns. Media habits were inherited, not chosen. This stability created consistency. Americans knew when and how they would receive news. Surprise was rare. The limited emotional engagement of media shaped political culture. Citizens observed rather than participated. Voting decisions were informed, but not energized. In retrospect, this era appears quiet. The absence of constant commentary allowed events to unfold without amplification. Media acted as recorder rather than interpreter. This approach had advantages. It reduced panic and polarization. It also reduced urgency and accountability. The news of 1980 reflected the society it served. Structured, restrained, and routine, it mirrored everyday life. Media did not seek to provoke emotion. It sought to document. For ordinary Americans, this meant news was something encountered, not pursued. Attention was given briefly, then withdrawn. Life continued unchanged. The media environment shaped expectations. News was serious but distant, important but not personal. This balance defined public attention. As the year ended, media consumption remained unchanged. The same papers arrived, the same broadcasts aired. The rhythm continued. Only later would this system be remembered as transitional. At the time, it felt permanent. Media, newspapers, and public attention in 1980 formed a quiet backdrop to history. Information flowed steadily, shaping understanding without demanding engagement. This subdued relationship between news and audience defined the era. It allowed Americans to remain informed while remaining emotionally distant. The headlines passed. The broadcasts ended. Attention moved on. And history continued, quietly recorded, waiting to be re-examined.
The end of 1980, a year that felt ordinary but changed America. As 1980 came to an end, the year did not feel extraordinary to most Americans. Daily routines continued, work schedules remained the same. Families gathered for holidays much as they had in previous years. The sense of living through a historic turning point was largely absent. Only later would the year be described as transformative. At the time, 1980 felt familiar. Economic concerns persisted, political debates repeated themselves, and international tensions remained unresolved. The passage from one year to the next followed established patterns. There were no sudden breaks in daily life, no immediate sense of departure from the past. The presidential election provided the most visible marker of change. Ronald Reagan's victory over Jimmy Carter signaled a shift in leadership, but transitions of power were routine events in American political life. Elections happened every 4 years. In that sense, 1980 did not seem unusual. Reagan's election night was orderly and predictable. Networks projected results, commentators analyzed voting patterns, and concession speeches followed established customs. There was no disruption to daily life. The election concluded as elections usually did, through process rather than drama. For many Americans, the result felt less like a revolution and more like a response to dissatisfaction. Economic anxiety, inflation, and a sense of stagnation influenced voter behavior. Reagan's promises resonated, but expectations were cautious. Few could predict the long-term consequences of his presidency. The transition of power unfolded quietly. The outgoing administration prepared reports, briefings, and schedules. The incoming team reviewed information and planned appointments. These activities occurred behind closed doors, largely invisible to the public. The mechanics of transition emphasized continuity. Institutions remained intact. Policies were reviewed rather than immediately replaced. This gradual approach reduced the sense of abrupt change. Public attention shifted quickly. After the election, news coverage moved on. Holiday preparations replaced political discussion. The election became another completed event rather than an ongoing concern. At the end of 1980, Americans did not feel they had entered a new era. Life continued much as before. Economic pressures remained. International uncertainties persisted. Political disagreements did not disappear. The lack of immediate transformation contributed to the perception of ordinariness. Change, if it was coming, had not yet arrived in visible form. The future felt uncertain, but not dramatically different from the present. Reagan's rhetoric suggested a new direction, but rhetoric alone did not alter daily experience. Policies required time to implement. Appointments took months. Legislative battles lay ahead. For ordinary citizens, the election's impact was abstract. Jobs, prices, and routines remained unchanged. The connection between leadership and daily life was indirect. The outgoing Carter administration faded quietly from public focus. Its challenges were documented, debated, and then largely set aside. Attention shifted forward rather than backward. Internationally, America's position appeared stable. Alliances remained, conflicts continued at familiar levels. No immediate shifts signaled a dramatic change in global role. The Cold War context remained intact. Strategic assumptions did not change overnight. Military and diplomatic institutions continued their routines. Media coverage reflected this continuity. Commentators speculated about the future but acknowledged uncertainty. Predictions were cautious. The tone remained restrained. Economic indicators at year's end did not suggest immediate relief. Inflation remained a concern, interest rates were high, unemployment figures offered little optimism. Families adjusted expectations rather than anticipating sudden improvement. Budgeting continued, spending remained cautious. Hope existed, but it was measured. The year's ordinariness was reinforced by its ending. New Year's celebrations followed familiar patterns. Reflections focused on personal experiences rather than national transformation. Looking back, historians would identify 1980 as a turning point. At the time, however, this interpretation was unavailable. Perspective required distance. The policies that would define the next decade had not yet taken effect. Their consequences were unknown. The future remained open. Reagan's rhetoric suggested a new direction, but rhetoric alone did not alter daily experience. Policies required time to implement. Appointments took months. Legislative battles lay ahead. For ordinary citizens, the election's impact was abstract. Jobs, prices, and routines remained unchanged. The connection between leadership and daily life was indirect. The outgoing Carter administration faded quietly from public focus. Its challenges were documented, debated, and then largely set aside. Attention shifted forward rather than backward. Internationally, America's position appeared stable. Alliances remained, conflicts continued at familiar levels. No immediate shifts signaled a dramatic change in global role. The Cold War context remained intact. Strategic assumptions did not change overnight. Military and diplomatic institutions continued their routines. Media coverage reflected this continuity. Commentators speculated about the future, but acknowledged uncertainty. Predictions were cautious. The tone remained restrained. Economic indicators at year's end did not suggest immediate relief. Inflation remained a concern. Interest rates were high. Unemployment figures offered little optimism. Families adjusted expectations rather than anticipating sudden improvement. Budgeting continued. Spending remained cautious. Hope existed, but it was measured. The year's ordinariness was reinforced by its ending. New Year's celebrations followed familiar patterns. Reflections focused on personal experiences rather than national transformation. Looking back, historians would identify 1980 as a turning point. At the time, however, this interpretation was unavailable. Perspective required distance. The policies that would define the next decade had not yet taken effect. Their consequences were unknown. The future remained open. Reagan's rhetoric suggested a new direction, but rhetoric alone did not alter daily experience. Policies required time to implement. Appointments took months. Legislative battles lay ahead. For ordinary citizens, the election's impact was abstract. Jobs, prices, and routines remained unchanged. The connection between leadership and daily life was indirect. The outgoing Carter administration faded quietly from public focus. Its challenges were documented, debated, and then largely set aside. Attention shifted forward rather than backward. Internationally, America's position appeared stable. Alliances remained, conflicts continued at familiar levels. No immediate shifts signaled a dramatic change in global role. The Cold War context remained intact. Strategic assumptions did not change overnight. Military and diplomatic institutions continued their routines. Media coverage reflected this continuity. Commentators speculated about the future, but acknowledged uncertainty. Predictions were cautious. The tone remained restrained. Economic indicators at year's end did not suggest immediate relief. Inflation remained a concern. Interest rates were high. Unemployment figures offered little optimism. Families adjusted expectations rather than anticipating sudden improvement. Budgeting continued. Spending remained cautious. Hope existed, but it was measured. The year's ordinariness was reinforced by its ending. New Year's celebrations followed familiar patterns, reflections focused on personal experiences rather than national transformation. Looking back, historians would identify 1980 as a turning point. At the time, however, this interpretation was unavailable. Perspective required distance. The policies that would define the next decade had not yet taken effect. Their consequences were unknown. The future remained open. Reagan's rhetoric suggested a new direction, but rhetoric alone did not alter daily experience. Policies required time to implement. Appointments took months. Legislative battles lay ahead. For ordinary citizens, the election's impact was abstract. Jobs, prices, and routines remained unchanged. The connection between leadership and daily life was indirect. The outgoing Carter administration faded quietly from public focus. Its challenges were documented, debated, and then largely set aside. Attention shifted forward rather than backward.